Hello everyone, welcome. Today, I want to talk about a concept that completely changed the way I understand inequality, identity, and honestly, society as a whole. And that concept is intersectionality. Before taking my ethnic studies class, I had never even heard this term before. But once I learned about it, I started seeing it everywhere. In history, in healthcare, in immigration policy, in the workplace, and even in everyday conversations. What stood out to me the most is that intersectionality doesn't just look at one identity at a time. It looks at the way multiple identities overlap, and how those overlaps can shape someone's experience with discrimination, privilege, or visibility in society. As a woman and as a college student, this topic hit really close to home for me because it made me think more deeply about the way people move through the world differently depending on their race, their gender, immigration status, so many other factors. So in this video, I'm going to break intersectionality down into 3 parts. First, I'll explain the definition and origins of intersectionality. Then, I'll talk about why it matters so much today and how it shows up in real life. And finally, I'll explain how we can actually apply intersectionality in our everyday lives and communities. So, let's get into it. When most people hear the word intersectionality, they think it sounds academic or overly complicated. But the idea itself is actually very simple. Intersectionality is the understanding that people can experience multiple forms of discrimination at the same time because of the combination of identities they hold. And to fully understand the concept, we have to talk about the woman who created the term, Kimberlé Crenshaw. Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality in 1989 while studying how Black women were treated within the legal system. What she noticed was that Black women often fell through the cracks of anti-discrimination law. If a company discriminated against women, the experiences of white women were usually centered. If a company discriminated against Black people, the experiences of Black men were usually centered. But Black women specifically experienced both racism and sexism simultaneously, and the law struggled to recognize that combined experience. Crenshaw used the metaphor of a traffic intersection to explain this. Imagine discrimination as a traffic coming from multiple directions. A person standing at the intersection can be hit from several directions at once. In the same way, someone can experience oppression from multiple identities overlapping together. That idea became the foundation of intersectionality. One of the sources I used for understanding this concept was the UN Women Intersectionality Resource Guide and Toolkit. The guide explained how systems like racism, sexism, classism, ableism, and xenophobia don't operate independently from one another. In fact, they interact and compound each other. I also watched an interview from Columbia Law School where Crenshaw reflected on the impact of her work decades later and explained how intersectionality has expanded far beyond legal studies into healthcare, education, activism, and media. Another really important source for me was a video called Kimberlé Crenshaw on Intersectionality, The Big Idea, where Crenshaw herself explains the origins of the concept in such a human and understandable way. What I personally find so powerful about intersectionality is that it forces us to stop simplifying people. People are not just one identity. You're never only a woman, or only Black, or only Latina, or only immigrant, or only queer, or only disabled. We exist at the crossing points of so many identities at once. And I think a lot about how women are often grouped together as if we all experience sexism in the same way. when in reality, race, class, religion, immigration status, and culture can drastically change that experience. Intersectionality creates space for those differences to actually be acknowledged instead of erased. So, at its core, intersectionality is really all about visibility. It asks, who is being overlooked? When can we talk about that inequality? And once you understand that question, you start seeing intersectionality everywhere. Which brings me to the second part of this video, why intersectionality is still incredibly relevant today and how it appears in real-world systems and institutions. One of the biggest misconceptions about intersectionality is that it's just theory. But intersectionality is not just an academic concept. It has real consequences in people's lives. It affects healthcare outcomes, workplace discrimination, immigration experiences, media visibility, and even, sadly, survival rates. One source that really stood out to me was an article from Osmosis Healthcare discussing intersectionality in healthcare. The article explains how healthcare systems often fail to properly support women of color, especially Black women and Latino women. For example, Black women in the United States experience significantly higher maternal mortality rates compared to white women. And intersectionality helps explain why. It's not just sexism or racism. It's the interaction between both. Biases in medicine, unequal access to healthcare, historical discrimination, and systemic racism all combine together to create drastically different outcomes for different groups of women. This part honestly felt really personal to me because healthcare is something every woman eventually interacts with. And realizing that not all women are protected equally was really eye-opening. Intersectionality made me realize that when we advocate for women's rights, we also have to ask which women are still being ignored. Another major example comes from police violence. One of the most impactful sources I watched was The Urgency of Intersectionality. In this TED Talk, Crenshaw discusses how Black women who experience police brutality often receive far less media attention than Black men in similar situations. Their stories are less visible, their names are less remembered, and their experiences are often erased from public conversations entirely. Intersectionality helps explain why this happens. Black women exist at the intersection of racism and sexism, which can make their experiences easier for society to overlook. And I think this is one of the clearest examples of why intersectionality matters. Because without this framework, certain people become invisible. And once someone becomes invisible socially, politically, or legally, it becomes much harder for them to receive justice or support. And I highly recommend watching that video, that TED Talk. It's really eye-opening. I also wanted to connect intersectionality to immigration because immigration experiences are not universal either. A study published in the Journal of Social and Political Psychology explained how immigrants entering the United States are treated differently depending on overlapping identities. The study found that refugees, undocumented immigrants, non-English speakers, and racial minorities often faced harsher profiling and treatment. Again, intersectionality helps explain why. An undocumented immigrant who is also Black, poor, female, or non-English speaking may face multiple barriers all at once. This section is especially connected to topics we covered in my ethnic studies class regarding the Latinx community. One thing I learned is that even within the same ethnic group, experiences can vary dramatically based on race and appearance. For example, Black Latinx individuals often experience harsher discrimination than white Latinx individuals. And that's intersectionality in action. The same applies to Filipinx and Southeast Asian communities too. Different racial representations within the same broader identity can lead to very different experiences in society. So whether we're talking about healthcare, policing, immigration, or education, intersectionality reveals the people who are most likely to be overlooked by systems that claim to serve everyone equally. And once you recognize those overlapping forms of oppression, it becomes impossible to ignore them. So now that we understand what intersectionality is and why it matters, the next question becomes, what do we actually do with this knowledge? I think the most important thing about intersectionality is that it's not meant to just stay in classrooms or scholarly articles. It's meant to be used. Intersectionality is a tool, a way of observing the world more carefully and responding to people more thoughtfully. For this section, I relied heavily on the UN Women Intersectionality Resource Guide and Toolkit. This guide emphasizes that recognizing intersectionality means actively considering who may be excluded from conversations, workplaces, healthcare systems, educations, and policies. For example, in workplaces, intersectionality can help employers recognize that diversity is not just about checking one box. A workplace may have gender diversity but still fail women of color. Or it may have racial diversity but still exclude disabled workers or immigrants. Intersectionality pushes organizations to look deeper, and I think this applies on an individual level too. If you're in leadership, student government, activism, healthcare, education, or honestly any social environment, understanding intersectionality can help you become more aware of who is being overlooked. One thing I've realized while researching this topic is that learning intersectionality requires humility. You have to accept that your own experiences are not universal. As a woman, there are certain experiences I relate to deeply, but intersectionality reminds me that another woman's experience may be completely different from mine depending on her race, her class, her sexuality or disability, or her immigration status. And I think that awareness is what creates real empathy. Not performative empathy, actual empathy. The kind where you listen before assuming. Intersectionality also helps prevent oversimplification. Without understanding it properly, people can misuse the term or incorrectly label situations as intersectionality when they aren't. That's why education is so important. Reading scholarly work, listening to lived experiences, following current events, and engaging with diverse voices all help deepen our understanding. Intersectionality has only recently begun gaining larger recognition in media, education, and public discourse, but its impact is already huge. It has changed the way we discuss feminism, race, immigration, healthcare, and justice, and I truly believe its influence will continue growing because it offers something society desperately needs: a fuller understanding of people. Kimberlé Crenshaw created a framework that gave language to experiences that had been ignored for generations. And because of that, so many people finally feel seen. Before taking ethnic studies, I genuinely didn't realize how much intersectionality shaped the world around me. Now I notice it constantly. I notice it in conversations, in media representation, in healthcare discussions, in immigration debates, in the stories that get amplified, in the stories that don't. And I think that's the biggest takeaway from this video. Intersectionality teaches us to pay attention to the people standing at the crossroads. The people who struggle are often layered, complicated, and invisible. Because real inclusivity only happens when everyone is seen. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope this video helped you understand intersectionality a little more deeply and maybe encouraged you to continue learning about it too. Bye-bye.